Good morning and welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Forensic Psychology. So today we're talking about why females commit offences and how that might differ from why males do that. And we're very lucky to have Elaine Cameron with us today, who's worked for many years with people who in prison and hospitals, and has worked for the last, we're just trying to work out, 12, 14 years with females. So welcome, Elaine. So I don't know if you want to start by saying a little bit about your career into forensic psychology.
Well, the idea I think first started when I was on a school placement, funny enough, because so I did a placement with children with behavioural difficulties in a school, and then went into psychology from that. And once I'd done my degree, I went on to look for jobs in clinical psychology, but started looking into forensic posts as well. And I was living in Plymouth at the time, and a job came up at Dartmoor prison for an assistant post, and I kind of fell into it that way really, and that was the beginning of the journey. So yeah, I was working in sex offender treatment programs, prison psychology posts for about 5 to 6 years, and then I went to do my master's in forensic. And while I was doing that, I went back to work. I worked in the community and youth offending team with young offenders. And then once I'd done my master's, I got my job at Grendon, where I was for 5 years. And from Grendon, I moved on to Broadmoor for 2 years, and then moved into post working with female offenders, where we set up in the end 3 services for women with who screened into the offender personality disorder pathway, and we had 3 psychologically informed environments set up at HMP Send, where I was for around coming up to 11 years there. And most recently I've moved back to the medium secure services for males in hospital again, so it's been quite varied.
Was there a sort of intention to move into working with females? Did you feel that that was something you really wanted to go into?
In the beginning, no. Do you know what really drew me to it? It was the fact, because I'd worked at Grendon and loved working at Grendon and the therapeutic community approach, very kind of relational approach. The post came up to work with psychologically informed planned environments, and it was also another very relational psychosocial approach. And it happened to be that they needed someone to lead on the female pilot. So it was kind of just came up really. I hadn't thought about it previously, but I'm really glad that I did.
I was just saying, could you say a little bit more for people watching about what a PIPE, a psychologically informed planned environment, is?
I think the original idea from them came from Grendon, actually, interestingly. So the idea was that you had these men that have been through very intensive therapy for several years, and then we were kind of placing them back in normal prisons or normal wings, where it was really difficult for these guys to keep maintain the skills that they learned. So the PIPE idea came up. Nick Benefield was the first one who I think it was Rex Haig and Nick Benefield came up with the ideas together and really took it from there. So it started off with progression PIPE. It's a bit of a journey really. It started off with something called a progression PIPE, which was for men and women who had completed any form of treatment. So again, to consolidate and maintain the learning that they've had in a really supportive environment. And the idea of a PIPE is it's very environmental, it's very psychosocial. You're upskilling the workforce. So most of my team are actually prison officers. And you're kind of wrapping around the service in terms of a real psychologically informed approach. And then later, when we kind of saw how well that worked, in a sense, I started to develop further ones, different models for. So I also led on a preparation PIPE, it's called, all these kind of weird names, for women who, as part, I sort of worked with the PIPE team to develop a model for women who had never completed any treatment or had high treatment dropout. Using the same principles, very relational, environmental approach. And I believe there's one other now, there's something called a provision PIPE as well, which is working with women who are in treatment and men who are in treatment. So the idea has really grown. I mean, we were one of the first 6 pilot sites, and now I think there must be around 30, both across the prison service and the community. So yeah, and then finally, just to tag on, we developed an outreach service as well to help people who were almost pre-engagement, so to help them start to engage with the environmental part.
Being in that you spent so long working with women, what has kept you in that kind of work?
I think working with females within the PIPE model was just such an amazing combination. I mean, I can only talk from my experience with the female PIPEs, but the females that we worked with responded so positively to the PIPE model. And it was, you know, I really enjoyed it. I was quite passionate about it. It felt like we'd grown 3 fabulous kind of approaches that really worked with women. The aspects of engaging them creatively and using very kind of normal day-to-day skills and interactions with them. So that really kept me there, because I could just see the reward of the approaches, and I could see the way that women developed. And in the, you know, actually, I really enjoy working with women. They're very different. They get bad press, I think, forensically and clinically. I think I was warned against going to work with women. People saying, "Oh God, don't do it. It's terrible, it's terrible." But I really enjoyed it.
Why do you think that bad press? Like, people say don't work with women, but what? Like, can you give more reason why? Like, what are the reasons people give you for not wanting to work with women?
Well, I think that female services are very different. Women act out their emotions very differently. So on the face of it, when you go into a female service versus a male, you're seeing a lot more emotion displayed. You're seeing a lot more kind of maybe what some people might see as aggression, very loud, very sort of, you know, where men tend to be a bit more kind of inside themselves and withdrawn and might act out violently, more instrumentally, or I think women are actually much more, on the face of it, look really difficult to manage. And that's what people fear. There's also greater self-harm rates as well, which people are really fearful of in women as well. So it's a very different feel in a female service.
So how did you cope with that then? Because I guess we know working with people who self-harm is really difficult for us as well. You know, brings all sorts of feelings up for us as well. How did you manage that? How did you all manage that?
There were two kind of approaches to it, 3 different. So one was that the PIPE itself was an excellent model to contain it, and we did show over time that we were able to really reduce rates of self-harm in quite prolific offenders, prolific self-harmers, and I think it's taking that very relational approach. You know, when women are enacting self-harm on themselves, rather than being fearful, it's just around being able to work with them and talk about it and help them express the feelings in different ways. So I think that's what we did. That's what our staff did. It was very much about engaging the women, doing a lot of training as well. We did a lot of training for the staff throughout the whole prison, and we were really instrumental in act reviews, particularly with women who are self-harming a lot. Having that involvement, more and more engaged you are with these women, the less fearful it becomes. I remember working in the male services where it was a bit kind of like, oh, don't ask the question, or, you know, kind of don't talk about it too much in a sense. But what we did was the opposite. It was very much about engaging, talking about it, asking the questions and getting the women comfortable with expressing what was behind the self-harm, really. We also had DBT for a while, so DBT is an absolutely amazing service to work with self-harmers.
And what is DBT?
Dialectical behaviour therapy. So that was running for a while in Send as well, and that was an amazing way to engage people who self-harm, both men and women, I think.
How is that different to other therapies?
It's a good question. I mean, you have in DBT, sort of pure DBT, you have the weekly skills group where you're just working on upskilling the women or men in coping with the drivers for the self-harm, and then you also have a one-to-one therapist, so you've got 2 modes working with them, which I think is really helpful. And it's very, very focused. It's very focused on the actual self-harm, the acts of it. Each week you're sort of going into the reasons for it, and then you're also teaching all these skills, so interpersonal effectiveness, emotional management. So it's kind of like you're getting an individual therapy, but you're also getting skills running in tandem And I think that's really important.
What's something in the perhaps complex needs services is working with people as victims and then as perpetrators. Is that the sort of model that's also implemented in the women's service?
What do you mean, working with them as separate entities, or working with sort of things?
Well, I guess yeah, well, we were talking a lot then about sort of self-harm and the coping and the skills, but these are people that have committed offences, hence they wouldn't come in contact with us in prisons and hospitals. Is that a sense that you work with the women, kind of work with their coping and the distress and the issues, and then perhaps go on and address sort of why they've come into prison?
I think it depends where they are in their pathway, which is the same as in a hospital. You've got different stages of the pathway, and someone can't work on the offences until they're stable enough or well enough to work with the actual offence. So it's really individual. So you may do years of work with someone, enabling them to be stable enough and grounded enough to go on to trauma or go on to the offence work. I think there's less availability for women to work on their offences in prison. That's definitely something that I'm aware of. So yeah, it really depends when that person's ready.
Why do you think that might be, that there's less opportunities for women to perhaps address some of those issues?
The programmes had all been designed for males in the prison service and in hospitals, and there were very few programmes that had been, specifically looked at for females around offending. We still a little bit now.
And it's interesting, I think, when we do lectures for universities on routes into psychology, we always sort of touch upon the issue about populations. And when we think about, I mean, the recent statistics, I think for prisons, it was something, 80,000 men in prison and 4,000 women. So I think that, I don't know, does that play a role in that sort of idea?
Yeah, absolutely. I think economically, you're probably, the thinking is you be better off putting your money into the greater population of offenders, which I can see that makes sense. So that is where the focus has always been.
Can you tell us about kind of your experience and thoughts about why women do commit offences? Like, is there a pattern? Can you talk us through a little bit of that?
I think this question comes up quite a lot, and I was thinking about it. I was thinking a lot of the factors in male and female offending are the same. They're similar background factors that contribute to someone offending, and some people will say, "Oh, it's very different." But my own experience, probably, and I remember I work with the more severe end of offending, I guess, with females than the less severe. But in terms of that population that I've worked with, the factors are very similar. Maybe some of the things I noticed that might be a little bit different might be that a lot of females offended within the context of relationship. What you could really see was a real deficit in terms of attachment disorders, relational skills, which again, I'm not saying the male offenders don't have, because I think they absolutely do. So often, you could see the females were offending within a context of relationship. So perhaps we're being with a male offender or being with an abusive male. Within sex work as well, that's something that comes up a lot with women, and they were offending in the context of that sex work as well. So they're the only main kind of differences really that we were pulling out, I think, and a lot of the others are very similar.
One of the things I really notice is with females is that people find it very difficult to report offences that have been committed by females, and I've worked only with men, so it's men I've had that experience with, but they find it more maybe shameful to say, and I was going to say admit, when actually that's they're not admitting something's happened to them, but it's almost like they find it shameful to say I've been offended against by a woman, and lots of them can't see themselves as victims of a female, and I guess in terms of stereotypes and power balances, you could see why that might be the case, but I wonder if there is a reason. Do you think people find it more difficult to say that something's happened to them, been perpetrated, sexual abuse for instance, or physical abuse by a female?
I think there's several factors that are involved with this. First, I think I'd start by saying I think it can be equally as difficult for a male and female to disclose abuse of any description. I think working with both populations, we all know how difficult it is to talk about trauma in the first place. And then I was thinking around the fact that females in prison will experience domestic violence from females in prison. So there was quite a lot of that in female offenders inside prison, and sexual assaults as well. And it was also really difficult for them to disclose being offended against from a female as well. And I think, my perspective is that it's less talked about, it's less understood, it's kind of perhaps seen for males as that kind of like ultimate abuse, in a sense, if your mother or a female carer has committed that offence against you. And I wonder if years ago, actually, it was like that if you admitted any type of abuse. So maybe in some ways we've moved on with being able to understand and talk about abuse from a male, but again, not so much for talking about abuse from females, because it's lesser known, it's rarer, it's not as well understood by professionals. So males, it's just not as easy to be able to talk about something that doesn't happen very often. It's not around you. If you think about the media and society now are really encouraging victims to come forward, which is amazing, but maybe it's not so talked about in terms of a female having committed that abuse. But and the other things, like you said, the stigma attached to that, the banter that males have around older women, and how that's sometimes seen as a kind of an accomplishment or something that they've achieved in a way. So going against that is incredibly difficult to change people's views, I think.
I wonder if you found with females as well, perhaps females who have committed sexual offences, is it harder for people to work with that? I think, again, thinking about how the media see females, I think it's always raises a real sense of emotion when people have found out somebody has committed a sexual offence and they're female. Is that sort of a feeling within the teams and working with people as well?
Females, I think there's like I said, there's less confidence. There's less kind of knowing, oh, what do we do? Perhaps with male sexual offenders, there are pathways, there are treatments available, it's been researched. So there's definitely a feeling of being less confident. There is less availability of treatment for them, or known treatment in a sense, and how to work with those offences, which is really difficult. But in terms of a greater response, that's not something I've experienced. I think because I've worked across both, I've experienced an equal response to working with sexual offenders and how difficult that can be generally. I think the media perhaps portrays a female sex offender, like we said, as being bad or mad in a sense, and that it's the ultimate taboo that a woman would offend in this way. But I just think it's still really not understood properly, really. There's a lot of research that could take place in this area, I think, and a lot of thinking about treatment for female sex offenders, and that they differ as well. I think what the media do is put them all in one box, like that they've sexually offended and that's it. And as with males, what we need to do is understand they're very individual and very different. There are, different types of female sexual offender in the context of the offence.
What is this lack of research about, do you think? Why is it an under-researched area?
I think for what you said, the reason is that you've got a much greater population of males where people are looking at how do you reduce the reoffending males, because they're the ones creating most of the offences. Yeah.
I wonder how that manifests itself in teams that are working with females, though. Like, does it leave people feeling undervalued, or that they're not as important in some way?
It did previously. I think now things have got much better, and I think the offender personality disorder pathway's done a lot of work around that, increasing the profile of female offenders and ways to work with them. So I think I can only talk for the team that I was in, but there wasn't a sense of that. There was a sense of this was quite exciting work, actually, and it was a real opportunity to do something that perhaps other people weren't doing.
Is it the same in risk assessment? Because I think we've said there's a bit of a lack of treatment. There seems to be a lack of research. Is that the same for risk assessment and working with women? I
mean, in some ways, there are female adapted risk assessments, I know, that are being used by people. But in some ways, it depends what you view risk assessment as, isn't it? I guess the kind of risk assessments we were using much more qualitative and relational, and that's how we kind of informed. I'm formulation led, and formulation is formulation. So yeah, in that way you work the same way, don't you, with the formulation.
One of the areas we've talked about on this series as well is about gangs, and I believe you've worked with females that have joined gangs and men, obviously, in prisons that have worked in gangs. Do you see different reasons that females have joined gangs as opposed to males?
People might say there are very different reasons, but just from my own experience, I think there are very similar reasons, again, in terms of the women that were joining gangs. It was very much about looking for a sense of attachment, belonging, safety, to be cared for, to find a structure and a family-like situation, which they hadn't had. But I think males are very much the same. They're very similar reasons. Maybe the women, perhaps a little more, if we go back to relationship context, perhaps sometimes it was around finding that relationship with a certain male, that so in order to have that relationship, they would have to join the gang in a sense. So intimate relationships and unhealthy relationships, I think, were quite very much present in the girls that were joining gangs. They kind of joined through being in a relationship with someone, with a male. Otherwise, it's just a real sense of women, these girls looking for something and looking for people to look after them, because they're generally very vulnerable young ladies themselves. And a sense of safety in the gang as well.
Would that be the same with kind of substance misuse? I know, just thinking about the rates of substance misuse and women in offending, is there connections there as well?
Yeah, there's really high rates of substance misuse within the female offenders that I work with. There were very few who hadn't had substance misuse issues currently and historically. So it was really, really prevalent across the females we worked with. And again, very connected to, when you look at it, when you sat down and worked with them around the substance misuse, very related to this kind of emotional need to suppress or make themselves feel better, or look for a way of kind of healing themselves through drug use.
I was wondering, is there a hierarchy in female prisons with a hierarchy of offences? Is that a thing?
Yes,
yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. It's very similar hierarchy. You've either got your long-term prisoners who hold certain positions, and then you've got your violent offenders who are perhaps, up there as well, with sexual offenders being very much at the bottom. It's similar to male prisons, really. It's something we worked with a lot on the PIPE in terms of hierarchy and ensuring that we had mixed populations on the PIPE at Send, so that we were talking to the women about the hierarchical issues, and same, very familiar to Grendon as well, in a way, how people would say that fence is better than that one, or this one's more acceptable than this one. So there was a lot of work around that went on in our service. But yeah, very similar hierarchies actually. So I was thinking about women and how they respond and engage therapeutically. And I think that males are much more insular anyway. Working with males, I find so much more difficult to get them to open up and to kind of trust and to talk about any type of trauma, is my experience. Whereas females, working with female services, they're much more able to voice it. They're much more able to disclose it. It's almost like containing it is very difficult for females. It kind of comes out very emotionally. So I wonder in that respect where their disclosure is higher, because they're more likely as well to engage in a talking way and think therapeutically. So I have wondered about that in terms of rates of disclosure as well. When I first started working with females, I couldn't believe I worked from males, walked into the female services, and they're kind of almost spilling over. It was just kind of leaking out all of this trauma and these experiences. Where with a male, that could take you, however long to get to them even slightly disclosing anything. So there's something around that as well, I think.
Does it almost mean that that some of those treatment interventions are shorter if you're getting a lot more content and engagement?
The trauma itself will take the same amount of time to work through. It might just be that you get there a little bit quicker with the women in terms of where they're able to in terms of insight and ability to engage in the therapy, I think would be quicker potentially. But then again, you'd have to take into consideration, again, it's about, are they stable enough? Are they able well enough to be able to talk through that trauma?
You mentioned earlier about more creative ways of working. Is that something you found working with women, that you'll use different methods perhaps, or?
So we talked about this in terms of the PIPE national leads kind of met together each month. So you have the males and the female services. And throughout the years, we talked about this, whether there were kind of gender differences in terms of the creative, because and do you know what? There were some really lovely things that both males and females love equally. Cooking, baking, both genders love engaging in that. Arts, again, equally engaging with males and females. I think we thought about for a while that males a bit more involvement in sport potentially, but you know, our women loved team building and sports days, absolutely loved it. Maybe not so much around watching football, etc., but we did have Wimbledon and rugby tournament competitions as well, where we were watching it on the news. So I think maybe the only thing I've noticed is that women do love to work with art and kind of making their environment nice and making nice things for themselves and their families, colour schemes, you know, and things like that. But a lot of it was quite similar in terms of how you could involve people creatively. Yeah.
I noticed that when I obviously worked at Grendon, and when I went to visit the PIPE, the TC that they've got, sorry, at HMP Send, the difference was almost the women had created a room that looked almost like a sitting room. You know, they'd made their own curtains, they'd made cushions, you know, they'd really sort of almost made a homely atmosphere. And whilst I think in Grendon they did do that at times, it felt much more homely visiting the women's TC versus the men's TC.
Yes, yeah, and I think the women's cells as well, they do create homes in that cell. They make it as home-like as they possibly can. It's really important for them. Their environment is very important for women, I think, and having some say over that environment and a little bit of input into the environment. And also we I guess the women really engaged in sort of creativity around children as well, around making things for children, cooking for children, and aspects like that. And maybe that, you know, I don't know whether the males would engage as well, but that was something that they engaged really well with and wanted to engage, learning more around kind of parenting, I guess, really.
And I think we've seen an increase in males doing that in terms of making DVDs of reading stories, storybook dads, things like that, to try and make books for their children and have that.
Yeah. So that, yeah. But the PIPE creativity, if you looked at a female PIPE and a male PIPE, you wouldn't see an awful lot of difference, I don't think. Maybe in the colour schemes. A lot of pink.
Something you said then made me think of even a smaller population might be the sort of younger females in prisons and hospitals. I mean, it's almost unheard of. I don't think of all the people I work with, if people say they work with adolescent females. It's been something I've not really heard of at all in my career so far.
I think the female psychiatric services do have high rates of working with adolescent females. And I think the psychiatric services, actually, young females can be really quite unwell. So yeah, I think the youth services are working with females again, but the population just being greater in terms of the male.
I wonder if it's that stereotype. It always seemed to be that if a female did something like that, they were unwell and they were sent to hospitals rather than prisons, and that seemed to have been a real stereotype, in almost that people couldn't again believe that female would do that because they were bad. So they were seen to be mad instead, and that seemed to be how they diverted into, certainly traditionally, into hospitals rather than to prisons.
Yeah, and I think there's still a bit of that about. There's still a bit of you know, particularly perhaps female sex offenders. In order to do that, there must be something very, very wrong with them. In female psychiatric hospitals, the women are very unwell. They're very, very unwell, and I've often heard references saying that a female psychiatric ward might look very different to a male psychiatric ward. I think, and also what I've noticed, it's more difficult to get women to transition from hospital back into prison than it is for males to transition back in.
Do you have any sense of why?
I think, again, stabilising the women in hospital is very, very difficult, because they're often they're on the end of the very unwell spectrum to be in hospital, because it's a smaller population, and seen as more extreme, perhaps the way they act it out, and self-harm and, you know, things like that are very, very difficult to manage in a prison when they're extreme, I think, whereas the males might have a lesser kind of acting out in that way. Yeah. And again, you've got to come back to this, it's a smaller population, isn't it? So there's not going to be as many transferring back into the prison system as there would males. But yeah, it's out there. Again, it's just not really talked about and thought about as much, I think.
We talked a fair bit about the media and the media influence on how we view females that have committed offences. And I was thinking, you know, in recent years, there's been lots out there about the female movement and having more rights for females, and there's an opportunity, I guess, on social media and in other avenues for, as you know, female general population to kind of come together and share in that experience. I was thinking about how that parallels in the prisons. Like, is there an opportunity for the females to talk about what's happening outside, and how, like, is there more of a community feel with the females?
I think it comes down to the prison, doesn't it, and what resources are available. Again, if you're lucky enough to have a PIPE or a TC, and there are environments in which that can happen. I think if you've got a prison with very little psychology, very little treatment inputting, it's a little bit more difficult, isn't it, to give people opportunities to engage in that. I think females are much more, if they have the opportunity, they definitely engage. They like getting together, they like talking, they like being really connected to the outside world. I think they're probably easier to engage if the opportunity is there in some way.
Is it the same with roles in psychology? Are there more roles than perhaps clinicians want to go into? Are they unfilled posts in the female sector?
Yes. Well, I think it's probably across the estate at the moment, isn't it? But yeah, it's incredibly difficult to fill psychology roles.
What would you say to people who are starting out, or perhaps thinking about working with women? What advice would you give them?
It's a whole different level of engaging with people, I think, when you're engaging with women. It does take sort of different strategies and different ways of working. But I think it's really valuable and important. And to try and get some experience, try it out, try and find a placement or some voluntary work working with women and see how that feels, because I don't think it's always the first thought that people have, really. And I'd also say that you can do that in forensic psychology. I think there's a myth that you can only really work with the female population or female adolescents if you're clinically trained or counselling, etc. But actually, within forensic psychology, you can absolutely work within female services now. They've grown, they've developed over the years, and there's a lot around now.
Do you have any future plans or aspirations in your field?
In the future, I really love working with young offenders as well. That's something I've always liked. Who knows, maybe in the future I work back towards kind of adolescent trauma, maybe.
Why have you always really enjoyed the adolescents working?
I quite like working in quite a creative, lively way, and I think that working with the women was something that's why I enjoyed that so much. Very sort of out there kind of behaviour, and you have to be really creative, and you have to find really kind of lively and almost theatrical ways of engaging. And I found that with the young people that I work with as well. You couldn't work in what we might think is a standard psychological way. You had to find really creative ways to do it, using sort of, you know, media and music and drama and food and all sorts of things. So that's probably where I really like working in that way.
I think you've really shown the opportunities there are within forensic psychology with the different roles you've had and how you've embraced them. And we've talked before about changing different positions or different workplaces and how challenging it can seem, but it seems reassuring that you can apply your skills in a different place.
Yeah, definitely. I think people aren't always aware that you can work in such varied environments in forensic. I think that's something I come across quite a lot. People seeing that you can only work in a prison or you can only work within a certain area. And I just think it's really important that's not true. You can absolutely work in very different environments being forensically trained, definitely.
Well, I'd really like to thank you today, Elaine, for giving up your time, and nice to see you and see you again. And just remains for us to say, let's talk forensic psychology.